Hello and welcome to the ArchieLuxry program. Today I'd like to talk about why I don't collect vintage Rolex watches. And I won't say you shouldn't collect vintage Rolex watches because, you know, that Rolex is a fantastic brand and the history of Rolex is truly amazing. I'm a huge fan of Rolex, and you know, in my own collection itself, I've got an Explorer 2 white dial, and my wife has got a steel and white gold Rolex Datejust ladies, and I think the brand is fantastic. I've always enjoyed pieces from Rolex, and you know, my first serious luxury watch was a Rolex Explorer 1. And you know, you look at things there, and the reason why I'm not a huge vintage Rolex collector is I don't think they're the greatest value. You know, you look at a vintage GMT, a 1675 in so-so condition. What's it going to cost? It's going to be $4,000 to $5,000. Now, if you wanted a vintage red Submariner, a plastic Submariner, what are you going to pay? Nearly $10,000. A Sea Dweller, plastic Sea Dweller, what are you going to pay? $15,000. And this is the whole thing. You know, whilst those pieces are wonderful watches, if you look at them, there is so much more pieces which are newer by a better maker that represent better buys. And let's take a look at that there. Omega's Speedmaster Professional, say the vintage model with a 321 caliber movement, and you look at one of those there, and they're actually a piece which is much better than a modern interpretation of that piece. But with Rolex, the vintage pieces aren't necessarily better than the modern interpretation. And this is the thing. The only thing that you would say is better is perhaps the bracelet on the Omega on the modern one is more solid than the vintage pieces. And you know, a modern Rolex is better than a vintage Rolex in terms of quality, in terms of material used, and the movement. As for beauty, well, that's a different issue, and that's all up to the individual person itself there. But this is some interesting things. Vintage Rolex watches in good condition are expensive due to demand, and they're really at crazy prices. And this is the thing. You know, if you're going to buy, say, a vintage 1665 plastic Sea Dweller, or would you rather for the same money buy an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Jumbo, say a reference 15200ST, and the Jumbo would be a few years old, or we could get a brand new Rolex Sea Dweller. And you know, when we're talking crazy money, for similar money like that, would you rather get a used, relatively modern Patek Philippe Calatrava? What would you rather have? And this is the whole thing with these pieces here, is that Rolex is great, but for the same money, I'd much rather have a later model, better brand piece. And that's why I don't collect vintage Rolex watches. I'm ArchieLuxry. Tell me what you think.